Hi there, today we're going to be diving into the 3 parts of reverb, why you should care about these 3 parts of reverb, how these 3 parts of reverb interact to create depth inside of your mix, and ultimately how to use it inside of your mix to get more professional sounding mixes. So welcome to Dinosaur Dog Studio, where I am helping independent artists mix and master their music professionally. If you don't know me, my name is Tyson. I am an engineer at Night Owl Music Group, where we help independent artists build careers inside of music. So first, I'm going to be covering an overview of the 3 parts, what they are and how they interact with one another in different scenarios, and then we're going to be diving into the DAW and show you a quick example of actually how to use these concepts in practice to create more professional mixes. All right, so let's dive into the 3 parts of a reverb, talk about how these particular parts of reverb actually impact the perceived distance of items inside of our mixes. And then again, at the end, we're going to show you exactly how to implement this inside of your mix. So the first part of reverb is the direct sound. So again, that's the sound directly coming from the sound source to your ears. The second part is the early reflections. So the early reflections is when it hits off of maybe one surface and then hits your ears, maybe 2 surfaces and then hits your ears. So this is telling you, so the early reflections is the primary way that humans understand distance from the direct sound. So depending on how soon they come and how loud they are comparatively to the direct sound tells us how close something actually is. We're going to dive into talking about this relationship even more in the coming slides and give you some visuals to help understand this deeper. But with that said, let's move on to the last part of reverb, which is the late reflections. So the late reflections is that characteristic whoosh sound that we hear. Generically speaking, the early reflections are dead or have completely died off by about 70 to 100 milliseconds after the direct sound. And so the late reflections is basically everything after that point in time. So the early reflections oftentimes are barely even heard inside of the reverb, and it's more just a sense of closeness to the listener, versus the late reflections is really what people hear and perceive as the reverb. Okay, so let's move on into an actual example and talk about this in practice. So the direct sound obviously is coming directly from the sound to us. The early reflections are coming from the sound source, hitting a surface, and then coming back to us. As you'll notice, it takes a while for the first early reflection to hit us comparatively to the direct sound. I cover that in another video on pre-delay, which is that difference between the direct sound and the early reflection in terms of the time delay between those two. Very critical in understanding this video, so if you haven't watched that one already, I will link it in the description of the video, just to make sure you go watch that one as well to get a full understanding of what actual reverb is. But let's continue on. So the late reflection, again, is the reflections that hit multiple surfaces, and there's tons of these late reflections, and it gives us that characteristic whoosh sound because there's a bunch of these reflections, basically delayed sounds, that are all hitting us at microseconds apart from one another. Assuming that the distance is related to the energy of these sounds, we're going to measure the loudness of these various items. Okay, so again, this is the scenario. This is the first scenario where the sound is very close to us. So the direct sound, let's just assume that measured in a DAW is 0 decibels. And then the early reflections, let's assume that, they have to travel all the way back to the back wall before they hit us. And so they're minus 3 decibels. So basically, half as loud as the direct sound. And then the late reflections, again, they have to go all the way back, hit multiple surfaces, and so then they've relatively died off by the time they hit us, and so they're at minus 6 decibels in terms of measurements inside of the DAW. So let's compare this against the other scenario where the sound is far away from us. How does that impact the direct sound and all these other, and the early and late reflections in terms of loudness that we perceive? So the direct sound obviously takes longer to reach us, so let's just say that that's minus 2 decibels. The early reflections, if you'll notice, have to travel actually a shorter distance before they reach us. So technically it should be louder than minus 3 decibels, but just for the sake of this example, we'll assume it's 3 decibels still. So but the early reflections, again, are traveling less far than the original one, so they would actually be a little bit louder. But the late reflections, again, similar to the early reflections, don't have to travel as far because they're already starting in the back of the room before they bounce off multiple surfaces and reach us, and so those are at minus 4 decibels. So let's compare these 2 scenarios really quick, and then we'll kind of talk about the actual implications that we can have inside of our mixes. So the direct sound, 0 decibels when it's close further, it's a little bit quieter. Early reflections, about the same. Late reflections, again, a little bit louder in scenario 2 when it's far away because they don't have to travel as far comparatively to the direct sound. So when we graph these out, you can see that the close section has obviously a pretty good drop off between the direct sound, early reflection, and then also the late reflection. Scenario 2 has less of a drop off, but we also start a little bit lower than that. What's very important to understand here is the difference between each of these steps. So there's 3 decibels between the early reflections and the direct sound, and then 6 decibels between the late reflection and the direct sound in scenario 1 when the item is very close to us. Versus scenario 2, the early reflections is only 1 decibel and then 2 decibels for the late reflections for the far away sound. This means that the relative difference between the direct sound and the reverb is smaller when things are further away. And this makes logical sense to us. Anybody who's played around with reverb inside of your mix, the more you turn up your reverb, the further items tend to sound from you, which is exactly this concept in practice. As we turn up the early and late reflections in our reverb, the sound sounds further away because it's essentially moving that one item in relation to the direct sound as is described by these graphs. So basically, the closer an item is, the larger relative volume change between the direct sound, early reflection, and late reflections. So when something is closer, there's a bigger change. Okay, so that's the one on the left. The next one is the farther away an item is, the smaller relative change between direct sound, early reflection, and late reflection. That is the scenario 2. Okay, in case you don't understand the graphs, you can use these definitions. But the graphs to me are much more helpful. If we dive in here, basically, so if we're trying to make something closer to us, we're going to reduce the sound of the late reflections and early reflections for a sound. The further away something is, we want to increase the early and late reflections. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward, but it does have pretty massive implications when we're trying to create distance inside of our mix. So let's dive into the DAW and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. If you're unable to get that professional sheen or quality or vibe for your songs, then I want to let you in on a little secret. Most mixers are trying to compensate their lack of professional mixes by getting more plugins, by using more advanced tips or tricks or techniques in their mixes, or relying on buying more professional gear in order to compensate for their lack of quality mixes. But in reality, most mixers' core problem is actually mixing subjectively or approaching mixing from just a creative mindset entirely. Obviously, mixing is still a somewhat of a creative skill. It's actually far more objective than most people realize. Because if we think about it, everyone agrees on what a professional mix actually is. If that weren't the case, then it would be an entirely subjective field. But in reality, mixing is actually incredibly objective because everyone agrees on what a pro song sounds like. And so mixing objectively can actually help you avoid being your own worst enemy inside of your mixes and ultimately allow you to just check all of the boxes that a professional mix should check, and then your mix will sound objectively professional. And so if you're mixing your own music and you're motivated to actually learn the objective skill of mixing, and if you want to ensure that your music sounds pro, then I would love to help you out by teaching you the 5 objective standards that everybody is judging your mix by, and how you can use objective mixing to solve those 5 problems inside of your mix, and then also how to do all of that in under 3 hours per song without pro gear, premium plugins, or utilizing templates or presets. So this is something that piques your interest, then go to theobjectivemix.com to order my brand new book, The Objective Mix. This will teach you how to mix objectively professional mixes every single time you sit down to mix. This provides you with my entire mixing workflow, along with all of the breakthrough lessons that I've learned in the last 16 years of mixing music. So if that is interesting to you at all, then again, go to theobjectivemix.com or click the link right below this video. Can't wait to see you on the inside. With that, let's get back to the video. Okay, so now we're gonna be diving into the DAW here and showing you exactly what I mean by those early late reflections. So if you missed the last video, we talked about pre-delay and how that impacts the perceived distance of various items using reverb. But now in this video, we're gonna be diving into the early and late reflection balance as well. So we're just gonna add that second layer onto this. So this is the lead reverb, and then we have our harmony reverb behind it. So we've already adjusted the pre-delay to match something so that these essentially are completely identical except for this one pre-delay function. The next thing that we want to do is actually go into the details, and we could change this early late reflection balance to identify even more what is further away versus close to us. So as we talked about earlier, the distance is impacted by not only the overall volume of both the early and late reflections, but the balance between the early and late reflections. So something that is closer to us is going to have a greater disparity between the early and late reflections, meaning the early reflections are going to be louder than the late reflections when it comes to reverb. So let's dive into here. So the lead reverb, or the lead vocal, I'm gonna have a pretty extreme example here. So we're gonna do 90-10. So basically 90% of the energy is gonna go into early reflections versus late reflections. So I'll just play that for you so you can hear how it sounds. Compare that against if I did the reverse. So this is 10% early, 90% late. So there's an obvious increase of perceived distance there. So here's the close again. So that late reflections, those are still there. They're just very, very quiet in comparison to the early reflections. So that is our biggest lever when it comes to distance of an item. Reverb actually has a distance knob as well. This is basically doing the same exact thing as adjusting these early late reflection balances. So just FYI, I use both of these parameters just to increase the perceived closeness or distance depending on what my goal is inside of my mix. But again, very, very helpful to be able to understand what's going on inside of the reverb as well if you have a different type of reverb, or you just have a different plugin that has different controls, and also just understanding the actual science behind a close or distance with reverb. Again, okay, I'm gonna leave that there. Let's go to the harmony vocals. So we already determined, right? So a greater late reflection balance is going to increase the perceived distance. So I'm gonna back that off to about, let's just do 55-45. My harmony vocals should be extremely far away comparatively to my lead vocals, even though I haven't changed the volume at all. And so let's do a quick dry run. So here's without any reverb with the harmony and lead vocals. I don't think about you, no. You don't think about me that way. I don't think about you, no. You don't think about me that way. So obviously, everything's louder just because there's more energy going on with these reverbs added. They are kind of overpowering the direct sounds a bit. And so the last lever we have, though, is actually related to the overall balance of these reverbs as well. So when we back off, say this lead reverb, let's back it off to -13 or so. So what I've done basically is decreased the entire reverb sound, both the early and late reflections for the lead vocal, but made it slightly stronger with the harmony vocal to increase that perception of distance. So the lead vocal should be much closer to us than the harmony vocals at this point. So let's take a listen. I don't think about you, no. You don't think about me that way. All right, so that definitely worked. Our harmony vocals are much further away than the lead vocal, and if anything, I could probably back these off a little bit more, just because they are gonna make some waves in the mix and take up some room that I don't really want them to. All right, so again, if you haven't watched the pre-delay version of this video, I recommend going back and watching that one, but also keep your eye out for the next video as I dive into creating the depth matrix inside of my mixes, a easy, predictable way using these principles that I just covered in creating depth across your entire mix very easily without actually creating too much reverb and creating too much mud inside of the mix while we're at it. So stick around for that, or watch out for it as it's coming out in the next week or so. So can't wait for you to dive into that one. But with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.